right, I'm good. Just let me know when you're ready. I'm recording the music, so we're good right now. So.
Yeah, we're good.
You ready? All right.
Yep. Welcome to the Epic Love Show,
I gotta do the intro, man.
episode 89.
Topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests, and not
I don't even have your mic on.
I was ready, man.
Affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing.
Hi, everybody out there in Facebook land. Hang around. We got a great show, everybody. Welcome to the Epic Love Show. This is episode 89. I am your host, Travis Suit. We are sharing inspiring stories of love through action. That's what we do every Wednesday here on the Epic Love Show, promoting the positive, brought to you by the Piper's Angels Foundation, whose mission is to support and improve the lives of families and people in the cystic fibrosis community. You can catch this show on W4CY.com live. It's live on Facebook. Next week, we'll be live on YouTube. If you are watching, I'd love for you to go to YouTube and subscribe to the Epic Love Show. And you can listen to this as a podcast on playback on Pandora, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and you can follow us on Instagram. So look out for those updates for upcoming shows. This month is Cystic Fibrosis Awareness Month, and we're going to dive right in. And I want to give a big shout out and thank you to all the COVID-19 frontline workers in essential services, everybody out there keeping our families and our community safe. And a birthday shout out to one of the gentlemen who was formative in getting the Epic Love Show off the ground, Mr. David Allen. Happy birthday. We love you, David. So an update on the COVID-19 relief campaign by Piper's Angels Foundation. This was a fundraising campaign we launched 9 days ago, and yesterday was Giving Tuesday now. We hit over $11,000 in fundraising as of yesterday. Thank you to all 115 donors over the last 9 days who contributed. We will be sharing the direct impact of those funds over the coming weeks and months for the cystic fibrosis families that are in need at this time due to COVID-19. So thank you to everybody out there in Facebook land who is tuning in. We love you. We're sending our epic love to you. Please hang around. This show, we're going to be talking about the story of the Piper's Angels Foundation and how it all got started, how we got here, and where it all began. And this topic's really important to me personally, as the founder of Piper's Angels and as the father of Piper, my daughter, who is now 12 years old and was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis when she was 4. My oldest sister, Leanne, also has cystic fibrosis. So our family's been touched by this disease deeply and in various ways. And, I've been now in the cystic fibrosis community as a parent for 8 years, and I've learned a tremendous amount, but I feel like I'm learning new things every day. I've gotten to watch some incredible shifts in the paradigm of CF from people who were fighting not to die, in the 70s, right? Children were dying at 5 years old. To now people are living into their 20s, 30s, 40s, and beyond. And, the medical advancements have been one of the greatest success stories in the history of cystic fibrosis, and that's a big part of why Piper's Angels Foundation exists today, and we'll get into that as well. So if you have any questions during the show, right now, I can't see the comments on the page on Facebook, but I know we've got you tuned in. I see everybody out there who's watching right now, and I really appreciate your eyes and your ears and your open hearts and minds as we share this story. And this is a very touching personal story, an inspiring story of love through action that I'm excited to share. And it's been an emotional roller coaster ride over the years. But this is, we've got an opportunity here. So I do see Sue did drop a comment, how you doing? So I can see some of the comments if they are on the Epic Love page. So if you're watching on The Crossing or Piper's Angels, I may not be able to see your comments with the new way that Facebook is set up. So please, if you can go to the Epic Love Show page, you can drop your comments there. I love your comments and feedback for the show this evening. So let's take it back. Piper was diagnosed at 4 years old. And up until that point, she had been experiencing cold-like symptoms, right? Like heavy coughing and a lot of mucus production and inflammation. And at night, you'd lie in the bedroom next to her and you could hear her cough, and it sounded like she had a smoker's cough of 40 years. And she was put on multiple rounds of antibiotics and steroids as a very young child. And it would knock back the kid crud, as the doctors would say, but then it would come back. And each time it came back, it seemed like it came back even worse. And eventually, when she was 4 years old, she got walking pneumonia. And they did a chest x-ray, and they could see the fluid in her lungs. And it was at that point that the doctor had suggested that she be tested for cystic fibrosis. And I remember at that time that I really didn't know what cystic fibrosis was. It sounded like one of those strange things that, only other people get, right? And it was, I kind of blew it off because I really didn't expect anything else. And I didn't expect her to have it, even though, she had been sick in those ways. It just really never occurred to me that would be the reality. And so when she tested positive, I got a phone call from her mom. I was driving on my way to work, and her mom called me and said, she was really upset. She said Piper tested positive for cystic fibrosis, and they did 2 sweat chloride tests, and she tested positive for both. And I remember getting off the phone, and I pulled over on the side of the road, and I was just overwhelmed by so many feelings and anger, and it was like I could feel this upwelling of energy inside of me, and really, I was so mad. I was really rageful, and I kind of thrashed around in the car for a few minutes, and I was really angry and upset. I pounded the steering wheel, and I just had to let that energy out. It was like a volcano erupting, and I kind of got through that initial storm of emotions, and I drove to work. And when I got there, I went inside to the bathroom, and I looked myself in the mirror, and it was really strange because it was like this major shift had happened, this awakening had happened, and I was looking at myself, and I was not looking at the same person who I looked at that morning in the mirror. And it was a very odd feeling. And I kind of got myself together, and I had obviously been crying, and I was upset, so my face and eyes were swollen, and I'd walked out, and the first person I saw was a good friend of mine named Lottie, and she looked at me and she said, Travis, what's wrong? And I just lost it. And she held me, and I cried, and I was speechless. And it was a really tough moment in my kind of, on my path to accept that. And, after her diagnosis, I was doing a lot of online research and trying to learn as much as I could about cystic fibrosis. And a lot of the stories you read online are horror stories. I mean, if, at that time, some of these new drug therapies hadn't come out, And this was only 8 years ago, but it was a lot of bad news about CF, and reading about some of the stories of these children who were, drowning in their own mucus, so to speak, and constantly sick, constantly in the hospital, needing long-term IVs, getting PICC lines, needing lung transplants, getting feeding tubes. And it just started to paint this really horrible picture of what the future of Piper's life would look like. And I remember that feeling of just slipping into the depth of that emotional heaviness in the darkness of it all. And it was so disruptive to life, to me, to my family, to Piper's mom, and it lasted for months and months, where we weren't really sure, what Piper's future was going to look like. And so eventually they set up an appointment with Piper's cystic fibrosis care team in her clinic, which was at Nemours Children's Hospital in Orlando. And, I remember preparing for that visit and having all these questions, but at the same time, just feeling so overwhelmed. And I remember driving up there, and, we were waiting in the waiting room. And if you can imagine, I'm watching Piper, playing with the toys in the waiting room. She's 4 years old, and she has no idea what, has happened and what this is all about. She's just at the doctor. And it was such an interesting perspective to have. And it really, really ignited so much of that turmoil and that fuel of wanting to protect my child and wanting to, do anything to help her. We went into the doctor's office, into the room, and one by one the different physicians and professionals came in and spoke with us. And if you don't know, the cystic fibrosis care team can involve a lot of different care professionals. You can have their main respiratory therapist. There's a psychologist. There can be you have the nurse, social worker. There's a range of clinicians, a gastroenterologist, that all address different aspects of CF life. And it was really overwhelming. I mean, every aspect of it, right? Hearing all the different information they were giving us. They were handing us pamphlets. They were giving us all this stuff. And when the respiratory therapist came in the room, one of the main questions that I had was, when I grew up, I played a lot of sports. And so I was very active and I was very athletic. And I knew how that helped me progress in life and maintain a certain level of fitness that kept my lung function strong. And so my questions were mainly around that. What can we do to keep her active and to keep her going? And that was my question, was, well, what activities? Is it swimming? Is it dancing? What is it? And the respiratory therapist said, yeah, any activities that can keep her moving and keep her lungs exercising would be good. But then she shared this story about how surfers in Australia who had cystic fibrosis were reporting back to their team, their care team and their doctor, with much better results than a lot of the other CF patients at that clinic. And the doctor was intuitive enough to notice and ask them, hey, what are you guys doing different than everybody else? And they said, well, we're at the beach, we're surfing a lot. And surfing, if you don't know, is a pretty heavy respiratory exercise. So that could explain some of it. But what was really amazing about this moment in history for cystic fibrosis was that discovery of the connection of cystic fibrosis to surfing into the ocean was the beginning of a new era for CF. And that doctor deduced that there must be something with the salt in the air and the salt in the water, which people have been going to the ocean for thousands of years to heal. And so it's not really new news, but it was never thought about in such a direct way for a disease set. And so they actually were able, through the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, to fund the research around this. And it's published in the New England Medical Journal that the salt water and the salt air, when breathed into your lungs, helps to hydrate the liner of the lungs and provides better airway clearance, right? So to give those listening or watching an idea of what cystic fibrosis is, just to kind of do a little segue here into what CF is. Cystic fibrosis is a progressive genetic disease. So it's passed down from both parents, and the child has a 25% chance of getting both genes, which would give them cystic fibrosis. Otherwise, they could just be a carrier, or they may not be a carrier of the gene at all. But it has to come from both parents. If the child has cystic fibrosis, it could be one of 2,000 genetic variations of cystic fibrosis. And the main gene is the delta 508 gene. So if you happen to have 2 copies of the delta 508 gene, it's likely you're going to have a lot more progressive symptoms than if you have 1 copy and an obscure nonsense mutation or 2 nonsense mutations. But there's thousands of different variations that people could have. There's roughly 100,000 people around the world with cystic fibrosis that we know of, 30,000 people in the US. And so when you have cystic fibrosis, what's occurring biologically in the body is that you have a cell, and I'm just going to make this really simple and kind of rudimentary, but you have a cell, and within the cell, your body naturally, there's a protein and proteins that control the inflow and outflow of sodium chloride, which we all know we're made up of mostly salt water and mostly water in our bodies. And when the cell with cystic fibrosis, there's a defective protein that doesn't allow the inflow and the outflow of the sodium chloride in your body, the saline in your body. And so it's kind of like if you left the hose on in the grass, you know, the hose is going to flood the grass. Well, in somebody with CF, that defective protein leading to this, you know, uncontrollable inflow or outflow of saline and sodium chloride in the body, it can cause an overproduction of mucus. And that can happen just like in a car system. You know, oil helps the whole system run better. In the body, mucus is a natural lubricant, and it helps everything run better. And so, you know, on all the liners of all of our organs and all of our cells, you know, there's this natural fluidity and viscosity. Well, if you have too much mucus in your body, in your digestive tract, or in your lungs, that's not good. And in your digestive system, that can lead to blockages. A lot of CF patients have to get surgeries, you know, right when they're born, because they're born with these blockages. And in the lungs, that's really dangerous, because if you have an overproduction of mucus in the lungs, any bad bacteria or bug or virus can go in, and it's like a wet, sticky, moist Petri dish. It can go in and stick. And so if that bad bug goes in and sticks, and then it grows like in a Petri dish, which often does in the lungs, because the lungs are very porous and very wet already, then the bacteria can colonize, and it can essentially wreak havoc on the liner of the lungs and cause inflammation, which causes lung tissue damage, which ultimately causes the decrease in lung function for somebody with cystic fibrosis. And so that's the basic rundown of the biological aspect of CF and what it is. And so to step back into the story, right, of the surfers and the salt water, so they made this connection that if by breathing salt air you in that mist, you can help clear those airways, and which would prevent infection, which would prevent hospitalization, and prevent that burden that could be on the family. And I just want to say thank you to everybody out there who's listening right now and really listening with an open ear and open mind, whether you're on Facebook or Instagram or YouTube or on one of these other platforms, because this story is so important to the development of why this show exists and why Piper's Angels Foundation exists. And so here I am sitting in this room with the respiratory therapist Piper and her mom, and she tells us about this story of Australian surfers and the connection to the ocean, and how surfing is like this incredible natural therapy that people with cystic fibrosis could participate in. And, you know, after going through Piper's diagnosis and the crushing weight and emotion of that, and the darkness of it, and then, you know, learning more about it, and you know, but still only a few weeks after her diagnosis, still not having any kind of grasp on anything, this gift of this story, this gift of this idea of a way that we could help Piper that wasn't on a prescription, that wasn't within the box of the, you know, medical community, that wasn't something that the hospital or the doctors had to dictate, something that we could take into our own hands and that we could help her with. And the fact that we lived in Florida, it was such a blessing and it was so uplifting. And although it didn't overnight change the fact that I felt, you know, terrible about Piper having cystic fibrosis, it definitely gave me hope that, you know, no matter what happens with her future, we could start tomorrow by getting her out onto the water or in a positive environment where she could stand to benefit from the salt air. And we could teach her how to surf. We could go out and get on the water. And that was really the beginning of this spark of hope and this kind of brewing creatively of like what we could do and how empowering that was. And so that was the beginning of it. And from there, there were some really amazing serendipitous moments that occurred following that point. And one of them actually happened at a Cracker Barrel restaurant, out of all places. This was maybe a few weeks after Piper, after that clinic appointment. And I'm standing in line with Piper at the checkout at the counter where the cash register is. And I'm on the phone with a family member and I'm talking about cystic fibrosis and Piper, and they were asking how she was. And as I got closer to the counter where the clerk was, I got off the phone and I went to pay, and the woman said, "Hey, were you talking about cystic fibrosis?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, how are you related to CF?" And I looked at her and I said, "Well, you know, my daughter Piper," and she was right there beside me. I mean, she was little though; she was 4, so she was teeny, right? You know, I said, "Piper has CF. She was just diagnosed." And the woman looked at me and she said, "Oh, you have got to meet." And it was like the beginning of this, you know, moment and the suspense. And she said, "You've got to meet Gary Ellis." And I said, "Okay, I'm willing to do anything." And so she told me about Gary, told me that he had a daughter with cystic fibrosis, and that began this new journey, this new opportunity, which was I looked him up. He lived down in Islamorada. He was really a legendary fishing captain and guide at this time. And I read their story online, and their daughter had been diagnosed like 20 years earlier. I think she was around 24 at the time. And my goodness, it was amazing. Their story was about how they got fired up and they created a fishing tournament series that ended up raising $30 million over 30 years or roughly. And just had become amazing advocates for cystic fibrosis and for, their daughter. And I remember reading about Gary, and Gary said, my dream is to outlive my daughter. And he did. And he passed away this year, earlier in the year. And he was such an inspiration and in so many ways. And so what I did was I contacted him and I set up this meeting to go down to Islamorada to have lunch with him. And he suggested meeting at Lorelei, which is on the Bayside in Islamorada. And I drove down there, and I remember going over the bridge into Key Largo. And I've been going to the Keys ever since I was a little kid with my parents and family, because I grew up in South Florida. And, there's a big bridge when you come off the stretch going into the Keys. You go over and you can see the Bayside for the first time. And I remember as a kid that always being such a magical moment where, there's like almost this decompression as you go into the Keys. You're in the islands and there's just a whole different vibe. But this time it was so different because I was on a different mission. The mission wasn't to go to the Keys to have fun. The mission was to go talk to this guy who, miraculously had been, I was told about at a Cracker Barrel, and this was for Piper, and to learn from him and to hear what he had to say. And it was emotional, and I had anxiety around it. And I got down there and had lunch with him at Lorelei. I remember sitting there waiting, and it was weird. It was like I was in a movie, because here I am sitting there, and I'm at this beautiful place on the water in the Keys, and there's these tourists, and they're drinking their beer, and there's kind of the local barflies all hanging out talking, and I'm at this table, and there's seagulls and pelicans in the water, and there's like happy people, and I was not happy. I was really upset, and I was really emotional, and it was amazing because nobody there knew what I was experiencing, and it was a great lesson for me, in a perspective of you never know what people are going through, and it's always good to be aware of that. So Gary showed up, and he was a really salty guy, really genuine, wearing the vented fishing shirt, the hat, the glasses. He was super brown and tan, and had a firm handshake, and was everything you would ever imagine about a legendary backwater fishing captain in the Keys. And we sat down, and he just cut right to it. And he looked at me and he said, Piper's going to be okay. And, you can help as much as you want to help. And if that's what your heart's calling is, you can dream as big as you want to dream. And he told me about their story and how they got started and how they started fundraising with these events. And it was really powerful. And what was amazing about that, kind of like what the lesson for me there was, leaving that lunch meeting with him was, and looking back, that story truly changed my perspective on things. And this is the power of stories. This is why I love this show, because we're sharing inspiring stories of love through action. Gary Ellis and his wife and their family, the way they rallied that community and what they did to raise money for cystic fibrosis was this unbelievable story. And it was a story of courage and daring and hope. It was a story of love. And it changed my life. And when I got back, I really had to sit with that and start thinking, at the time I was producing events. My background was in marketing and promotions and content and sales. And I was a young entrepreneur, but I had passion, and I had purpose, but my purpose was changing, and the meaning in my purpose was really shifting. And so it was a huge kind of paradigm shift in my own world, because now here I was in kind of the for-profit world, and all of a sudden everything I cared about and everything I loved and everything that was meaningful in my life and purposeful started to shift into this nonprofit world. And the next person I met with was Chris Lanchu, who was the executive director of the Fort Lauderdale chapter of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. And I met with her from a suggestion from Gary Ellis. It was a referral. So drove up, met her in Boca at a Starbucks, sat down, and she was only the second human. So Gary Ellis was the first human I met who really knew anything about cystic fibrosis and was a CF parent. And now this is a professional in the industry who has done amazing things for the CF community and been in that community a long time. And boy, she spoke to me with such confidence and clarity, and she lifted me up, and she really gave me so much hope about the future, about all the drug therapies and things that were coming down the line in the CF community. And that was like threw a little more fuel on the fire, right? Gary gave me that spark. He told me that story. And you know, that the story of the CF surfers in Australia in the salt water, that, you know, it was like each time that spark occurred again, you know, it gave me a little bit more fuel. And as that built and as that grew, that fire in me started to grow, and it was healing me. And, you know, that was what I call the rally factor. That was that fire inside of you that starts to grow, that light, and, you know, people giving you that hope. And so Chris had invited me to come out to some of these Cystic Fibrosis Foundation events and participate, and actually even asked me to speak, which was nerve-wracking. I had spoken and emceed some events before, but I had never spoken or told such an emotional story about Piper and this diagnosis, and it was so raw and real. You know, I always joke with people, I had to do like 2 shots of tequila at the bar before going up there and being able to talk about it. And you know, and now I feel so comfortable and confident speaking about it, but it took practice. And I would tell anybody out there who's listening to this, if you have something you're passionate about, or you have something that, you know, is really driving your purpose, or your purpose is driving your passion. And this is kind of what I like to compare it to. The experience what was happening is, and in the way I can relate it is, if you think about the scales of justice, you know, the deeper your purpose becomes in life, and you can take that purpose because it's, you know, true purpose is born out of an infinite source of love and compassion. And you can go as deep into that as you want. And the depth of your purpose invariably intensifies your passion. And when your passion is through the roof about something, nothing will stop you. Yes, you're going to have bad days. Yes, you're going to have setbacks. Yes, you're going to wake up some days and not want to get out of bed. Yes, the burden and the depression or anxiety or stress can get to you. The resistance can be there. But if you've got that deeply rooted purpose and your passion is really boiling over, you will get through those dark days, those hard times. No matter what adversity shows up in your life, you'll be able to push through it. As we like to say, you'll be able to be bold in the face of fear and push through it. And that was that shift in my life that was taking place. And so the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation of Fort Lauderdale invited me to participate in an event called Fort Lauderdale's Finest. And it was honoring young people who were doing great things in the community. And it was a fundraising event. And so I was, you know, thinking about a lot of different things that I could do to fundraise. And at the time, because of this connection to the ocean, I had been taking Piper paddling a lot. And because surfing isn't necessarily the easiest thing to get a kid in the water and do. You know, there's a lot of hazards out there, right? There's currents and there's riptides, and, you know, you have to have the right day at the right time to be able to teach a kid to surf in Florida. You know, and so paddleboarding became this natural thoroughfare, this avenue I could get her out on the water, and it was great. Some of the best memories I have of Piper when she was a child, she's 4 years old, she's sitting on the front of my paddleboard, we're paddling along, we're out there breathing that salt air, enjoying that environment, and here we are together, one-on-one, really intimate time. And she had her imagination running wild. She was telling stories of mermaids and fairy tales and princesses. She would pick up things out of the water along the way, like sticks and things, and she would just get caught up in the imagination of it all and the mystery and the magic. And I would just my heart was just overflowing with joy on those days out there with her and listening to her and remembering how I knew those moments would be moments I would always cherish. And through that process, I fell in love with paddleboarding. Being out on the water, it's such a unique perspective to be standing on a board. And I was researching paddleboarding online, and I saw these guys out in Hawaii doing these long distance crossings and between the islands. And I was like, whoa, that is amazing. They're paddling like 50, 60 miles, through the ocean. That is awesome. And I remember thinking, I think this was 2011, and I remember thinking, I bet you could paddle from the Bahamas to Florida. And sure enough, that following summer, there were two gentlemen who actually did it. They paddled from Bimini back to or essentially North Miami Beach. And they had accomplished it. They had done it, and they did it with a sailboat. And I remember reading about it online, and it was Bill Whidden and Thaddeus Foote. Shout out to those guys, true watermen based down in Miami. And that was it. That solidified that idea that, I could do this. I could paddle from the Bahamas to Florida, and I could train for it, and this could be my fundraising mechanism. And I could raise money for cystic fibrosis, and this could be what created that awareness that I was looking for in kind of a big way, but something I could take on and do on my own. And I remember calling my parents and telling my parents, this is something I really want to do. I actually moved home and stayed with them while I was training because I took time off of work and really focused on just getting ready. I had no idea how difficult it was going to be. My goal was to paddle from Bimini in the Bahamas back to West Palm Beach, Florida, which was over 100 miles back to Palm Beach Inlet. And so it just began from there. And I started telling friends and family this was what my plan was. And I really do believe that this is a big key to the magic of life, which is anytime you want to be a master manifester, you want to create something, you have to understand that we were given the talent and the gift of using our voice. Our voice is the creator of vibration. What you guys hear right now through this microphone is being amplified. You have to realize how powerful vibration is. Vibration makes up everything in the universe. Vibration makes up our body, light, everything is a vibration. And so when you start to share your ideas, they start to become a reality because other people can believe in them. And now the vision can be held by many and not just one. And so I started telling everybody this is what I was going to do, even before I had a paddleboard. And people thought I was crazy. My dad had a really funny line. He said, son, that's really crazy to paddle from the Bahamas to Florida. You're going to have to go through the dark. And he said, that's why God invented Mercury's, like Mercury motors for a boat. That's how people could get powered across, right? And so I had a friend who said, hey, you got to go down and meet this guy who he does paddling. His name's Kyle Igneri. And I went down and met with Kyle. He had this paddleboard shop. And I started telling him about it. And he said, hey, I'll support you. You can come down and use boards anytime and train. And he had been out in Hawaii. He was a real waterman and spent a lot of time in the water. And he said, but here's the thing. If you're going to do it, I'm going to do it. And I was like, dude, yeah, that sounds great. I mean, paddling, it's fun by yourself and it's beautiful. You see a lot of wildlife and it's really peaceful, but it can be a lot more fun when you have friends paddling with you. So I said, dude, I would love if you jumped in. And so sure enough, he did. And that began the process. And one thing after another, boom, 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 everything started falling into place. Had a great friend from college named Lauren. Her company Power Design became the first sponsor of the crossing. And they were going to help contribute so we could cover some of the costs to do the event. And then I got introduced to another friend, Lee Heaton, who owned a venture boat company. And I said, hey, we need some support boats. And that was really the big last final straw that we needed to hit. And he came on board. And so over a period of a few months, it all started coming together. And I created a a little website on Wix and started taking a $100 pledge per mile. That was the goal, 90 miles, $100 per mile. And, I'll never forget Jimmy George, a guy I didn't even know at the time, up in Maryland on Facebook. He pledged the first mile. And my mom was upset. She's like, I wanted the first mile, and it was just amazing to start to see this outpouring of support for this idea. And so we really started working towards it. And the first crossing happened in 2013. And I could talk for hours just about that first experience, but we didn't get the weather we wanted. The Coast Guard had advised against it. And we just got, Mother Nature just brutalized us. It ended up being 4 of us paddling. My friend Shane Pompa joined, Joseph Morel joined. And that year, when we got back, we had paddled 90 miles over water. And we ended up, it was a horrible night out in the ocean. 4 to 6 foot swells. We were running into the back of the boat. It got really scary and dangerous. But we made it. And when we made it back to the dock, we were a lot earlier than our projected time. And I'm covering a lot of ground here, but it was really interesting because the media was there. And I believe it was the Palm Beach Post did a write-up about this crossing and the fundraising for cystic fibrosis. And they they coined the term Piper's Angels for our group. And that became, the name that later on became the name of the foundation. Well, I was only planning on doing the crossing once. It was kind of a one and done thing. I did the Fort Lauderdale's Finest event, was honored there, and went back to my normal quote unquote life. And, we just stayed taking care of Piper and focused on her. And, it's a little known kind of part of this story, but that same year Piper was diagnosed, my sister Leanne was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis as well. And she has a different genetic variation. So she was diagnosed at 40 the same year Piper was diagnosed at 4. And she had already had half a lung removed at the Mayo Clinic. And she has her own unbelievable story that we will share on this show about her journey with CF. But, Piper was doing okay until she was 8. And then she got really sick that year and had a couple months of long-term hospitalizations. And she ended up in the hospital up in Orlando, and she ended up needing to get a feeding tube and a long-term IV port. And it was just a really hard experience for her and everybody. Balancing the time at the hospital back and forth with Piper's mom, our family, watching Piper suffer and be in pain. And I tell this story about, how when I grew up, my dad was a Marine, my mom was a teacher. And so I really had a hard time asking people for money. It wasn't in my nature to put my hand out. And so at these events, when I would speak, I would tell the story, and then somebody else would come up and kind of ask for the money. Well, Piper was in the hospital one night, and it was around midnight, and she was asleep, and I was asleep on the cot next to her. And she sat up in the middle of the night. I could hear her. I sat up and looked at her, and she looked over at me, looked me dead in the eye, and in tears, she said, through her pain, she said, "Daddy, my lungs are burning." And, I got up, I went over and consoled her, called the nurse. The nurse came in. I think they gave her some pain medicine to help her settle her down. She fell back asleep. And I've never felt that pain. I've never felt my lungs burning, but I went out in the hallway, and I leaned up against the wall, and I collapsed in emotion and tears. And I just wept, and I was by myself, sitting on the floor of a hospital hallway up against the wall at 1:30 in the morning. And that was the moment that I promised myself that there would be no shame and there would be no selfish fear about asking people to help these kids and asking people for money to help these families, because we were experiencing it. And I have a great family. I have an amazing family. My sister Nikki, my parents, everybody in my family is incredibly supportive. So we were going to make it through that time. And but it was so easy to see how there are so many families that struggle. Single moms with kids with CF, families with multiple children with CF, so many circumstances where long-term hospitalization and cystic fibrosis is this can become such a huge emotional and financial burden on these families. And I drove that next day down to Jupiter, Florida, and had to speak at an event. And I remember getting up there, and I told everybody, I said, look, I just left the hospital. I'm an emotional train wreck. I'll do my best to push this through the tears, but all I can ask is that you please give, and that you please understand that I'm having to find a way to see how this curse of a diagnosis could really be looked at as a gift on how it's helping people and how it's empowering people and how it's bringing our family together. And that really began the shift of really coming at this with a sense of gratitude. And it was from that point that I decided, I've got to do something more. And we've got to find a way to help these families and focus on the help for these families. And we've only got a couple minutes left on the show. And I've given a lot of the backstory of Piper and her diagnosis and this is Cystic Fibrosis Awareness Month. And I really wanted to share this so people understood. And so, this was the turning point in the story where we decided to create Piper's Angels Foundation and to start supporting CF families. And this is going to have to be part one of the story. And I'll come back. I'll come back next week and tell part two, and really land the plane on this so you guys can hear the rest of the story. I appreciate everybody tuning in and hanging in there on the live. If you have any questions, I'll be able to answer them hopefully next week on the YouTube broadcast. But thank you all for all your support. Thank you to everybody who supported our recent campaign for fundraising for COVID relief and in making this week a great successful week for supporting CF families. This was the part one of the Piper's Angels story and how we got started. And what are you trying to?
Sorry, I'm actually following the Piper's Angels Foundation page for you.
Oh, okay.
So, Chris Smith actually wanted to say, Travis, please tell the people how much I love them for doing the crossing.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. Chris is a CF dad, and a shout out, a great way to end the show. And that was actually, it's amazing that he's the guy who just reached out because, as we created Piper's Angels Foundation, the Smith family, their daughter, Michaela, was the first family we were actually able to support and help. And that was back at the beginning of 2017, the end of 2016. So we'll pick it up from there next week. Thank you all for tuning in. Really appreciate it and appreciate the love and support. Really grateful for everything and supporting this show and understanding what Epic Love is about and understand why it's so important to share inspiring stories of love through action. So if you have an inspiring story to share, we'd love to hear about it. You can reach out. We're looking for guests for the show throughout the year. And do us a favor and subscribe to the YouTube channel, Epic Love Show on YouTube. And keep promoting the positive. Keep bringing your epic love to the world. And we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody. Love you.